Hey everyone, welcome back and thanks for joining me for another devlog for Dauphin, my 2D open world RPG about a marine biologist that I'm building with Godot. Once again, it has been far too long since the last update, so I appreciate y'all being patient with me. As always, life is just catching up and keeping me busy, but the good news is I have continued to make progress, and if you're subscribed, you probably saw that about a week and a half ago I put out a Dauphin deep dive, which will get you pretty well caught up with what I've been working on recently. The short and sweet version is that I've been working really hard to overhaul the way I procedurally generate islands in Dauphin, and I had two goals with this rework. The first was to take what was previously kind of arbitrary values between -1 and 1 in my height maps that I was creating and convert those to meaningful elevation and depth values, meaning that now I can tell when the player should be diving into a 50 meters deep ocean scene versus a 200 meters deep ocean scene. And now I have elevation data above ground that I can use to create more interesting terrain on islands. My second and definitely most important goal with this rework was to give myself more control over the output of this procedural generation system, meaning that if an island was spit out that I really liked, had a great shape, I could then go in and modify those elevation values to allow me to create some terrain in an interesting place, or maybe in the water around an island I could create a deep trench that the player could dive down in and find some special treasure. This is my way of being able to kind of add a personal touch to the output of this procedural generation system to make these feel less randomly generated and more handcrafted. In this episode, I want to keep leaning into this world building momentum. Now that I have really cool looking islands that I can generate on the fly, I need to populate them with life. It's such a core concept to Dauphin because as the player, you'll be moving between these islands, exploring and encountering different organisms that are affected by corruption. The goal, of course, is to remove this corruption, make the environment healthier, and restore it to a more natural state. I think this is going to be super fun to work on in this episode because if I manage to get it right, it's going to be one of these videos where the game just looks so much cooler at the end than it does currently. But for now, as you can see, it's getting a little dark around me outside. I think I'm going to relax a little bit on this Sunday evening and get after it first thing in the morning. Hey everyone, quick check-in here. I've been putting a little bit of thought into how I want to kind of architect this solution, and I wanted to get y'all up to speed. What we're looking at is a new environment data resource class that I've just started building out. It's obviously very sparse so far, but hopefully you can see where I'm going with this. The idea here is that for any given scene into which I would like to spawn organisms in Dauphin, I can create and inject an instance of this environment data resource to describe the environment in which those organisms will live. So I have this now as an export for my base island, for example, so I can expect every base island to have environment data associated with it. You'll also notice that as a child of my base island, I now have a class called Flora Spawner. This is empty right now, but in a future state, it's going to take in the environment data associated with this island and make decisions about which organisms to place into the world based on various characteristics of that biome. Hard to say how well this is going to work, but I do really like the idea of this all being data-driven from the environment perspective. So I'm going to try to code some of this up and we'll catch up soon. Hey y'all, good news, we have made it to Friday afternoon, and honestly throughout the course of this week I've made quite a bit of progress on the organism spawning system, so I want to give you a quick look. I know you caught a glimpse from that B-roll, but I've made a few more tweaks since then, so I want to start with a blank island here and just walk you through start to finish how the spawner works. So we can start adding to this island by selecting the flora spawner in the hierarchy and taking a look over at the attributes panel where we can see all the properties that we talked about before exposed through export variables. So we have the height and width of the map, in this case 2048 by 2048, the spawn interval, which will be the distance between spawned objects, or basically the density of organisms that will spawn in. We have positional variance so that they don't all spawn on a perfect grid. And most importantly, we have an array of organisms here, or more specifically, organism data. Having all this organism data available here is core to how this works, because this is what we can compare with the environment data that's attached to the island itself to see what matches up and what organisms will be available or appropriate to spawn onto this island. So for example, if I open up my palm tree organism data, apart from all the metadata that I have associated with this organism, down at the bottom we have what's important to the flora spawner. The terrestrial environment type, which corresponds to islands here instead of underwater scenes. The environment biome, in this case tropical, which matches up to our island. And down here at the bottom, we have the minimum and maximum elevation, which will tell us exactly where it's eligible to spawn in this island scene. For this little demo, I've configured my palm trees, raspberry bush, and a new breadfruit tree that I've been working on, all to spawn within tropical islands, but within different elevation bands. So to see this in action, all we have to do is click the spawn button here. And pretty much with no delay, we see all these items spawn into the world. Now, as I mentioned, these are configured to spawn into different elevation bands. And what I mean by that is that if we open up the palm tree, you'll notice that we spawn at elevations between 0.5 meters and 4 meters. So as we'd expect, we tend to see palm trees closer to the coast and the water where that elevation is super small. In contrast, my breadfruit trees, which are these guys here in the middle, are configured to spawn between 4 meters and 10 meters. So it kind of gives a nice layout and distribution of these various organisms across the entire island. Within my flora spawner class, most of the heavy lifting is being done in the spawn flora function. We pretty much just loop through the entire size of the map, keeping in mind, of course, our spawn interval or density value. We find the spawn point, we query the elevation at that point, and then we select an organism that's appropriate for that particular elevation. At that point, we just load up an instance and put it in the world. Selecting organisms themselves is where things get more interesting and where I'll be investing more time in the future. Right now, all we're really doing is filtering through that list of organisms over here on the side and seeing which ones pass our elevation check, meaning that their minimum and maximum elevation match up with the elevation of the position at which we want to place them. Once we have a list of filtered eligible organisms, we create a drop table from those and roll for one of those from the table to place into the world. My initial impressions here are pretty positive given the relatively small amount of work it took to get this up and running. Obviously, once we start walking around the island here, you can see that there's a lot of tweaking that I could do to kind of improve the layout of where things are actually placed and make everything look a bit more natural. But off to a good start here, and I think I have a great foundation to build upon as I continue to add different organisms and add nuance to the way they're placed. Had a pretty busy day at work today and looking forward to some relaxing time with family tonight, so don't think we'll be making any progress this evening, but I'm looking forward to an early start tomorrow. Happy Saturday, folks. Had a great start to the day today. Really enjoyable development session this morning. Got a good lift in afterwards, and just at about 2 o'clock in the afternoon right now, Kate and I have wrapped up our house project for the weekend. Feels really good to have that done with so much of the weekend ahead of us. My focus this morning was very straightforward, being generally happy with how my flora spawner is going, although this certainly needs more tweaking. I thought it would be fun to duplicate it and create a fauna spawner, which right now is pretty much just responsible for spawning my sand crab organism here. I was thinking at one point that I could wrap both of these up into one organism spawner, but it's really nice to have two instances here where I can easily customize the list of organisms that each is responsible for, as well as these different parameters like the spawn density and positional variance. And as you'd expect, this works really well. I am loving running around on this island and being chased by sand crabs like the good old days before I started re-architecting all this stuff. I think we're definitely moving in the right direction, and I think what's going to make this even better is just a greater variety of organisms. I have a couple different kinds of trees, a couple bushes. What will really make this feel more alive is just a denser covering of grasses, flowers, new bushes, new trees, things that really make this feel like a diverse ecosystem. So that's where I want to put some more effort this weekend. If I'm being honest with myself though, I'm feeling like taking the afternoon off. We had a super productive morning, worked on Dauphin, worked on this video, painted cabinets, got a good workout in, and I think having a relaxing afternoon and evening is just going to recharge me and give me an even better place to start from tomorrow. So I am going to very much enjoy this evening, and we'll catch up in the morning. Welcome back everyone. It is now Sunday afternoon. I had a great relaxing evening last night, super charged up for today, and I had another great start to the day with some really cool changes I've made this morning that I'm excited to show you, and just a couple more that I have in mind to make this afternoon to wrap up this devlog. I kicked off this morning by creating a new organism for Dauphin to help improve the variety that we see on our islands, and this is that organism. For now, I'm just calling it beach grass, but the idea here is that this would be an organism that would be much more densely populated on the island, in this case kind of acting as something that would be in the dunes, kind of in between the sand and the grass. If we jump over to the island scene itself, I have already gone ahead and injected this into my flora spawner and populated the map, and we can see what a difference this is making already. There's a lot to be fixed here in terms of the density and the fact that these all look the same, but so far I'm really happy about the visual variety that this is introducing to the scene. The plan for this afternoon is to further improve how things are looking here by introducing a bit of helper functionality that I honestly should have put in Dauphin quite a while ago, and that is the ability to support multiple variants of a single organism, meaning that I maybe have 3 or 4 visual variants of this grass that can be spawned into the scene. And similarly for things like these palm trees, these are all exactly the same height and shape. Maybe it would be a big help just to have 3 different sprites of different heights, and maybe some that are flipped horizontally to introduce some more of that visual variety into this scene. That should be no problem at all to code up, so I'm going to knock that out now, and I'll join you in just a bit for the final update of the devlog. Alright folks, good news, that did not take up too much time as expected, and I'm now able to support multiple variants of the same organism. So I've got 3 different sprites here for my beach grass, and 2 different sprites for my palm trees here, just as a little proof of concept. I had to make 2 small changes to support this, and the first was to actually make the new variant of the scene itself. I did that by just going to my base palm tree organism, right-clicking and selecting New Inherited Scene. That copies all the properties to a new child scene that inherits from this palm tree organism, and I just named this Palm Tree Organism Variant 1. The reason I chose to make this an inherited scene is so that if I need to make some kind of structural change to how these palm trees work, I can just do that in the parent and it will propagate down to my variants. And the nice thing about having a standalone scene as a variant is that if the sprite happens to be much larger or smaller, I can go in and tweak the individual collision shapes associated with this variant and not have that affect the parent. Next up, in my organism data resource, where I previously stored the path to that scene in my organism path string, I now just keep an organism variant paths array of strings. When it comes time in my organism spawner to actually create one of these organisms, I can look at that organism variant paths array of my organism data and just use the built-in pick random function to pick one of those variants. After regenerating the flora and fauna on the island, everything is working as expected. And again, what's really awesome is that I can do all this at development time with that tool script. It's great just to be able to get all of this stuff into the scene in generally the right locations, at which point I can go in and always tweak anything that looks out of place, anything that looks unnatural. It's just a great starting point to get my creativity flowing. It's worth mentioning that, of course, there's still a lot of work to be done here. This is really only a fraction of the environmental variety that I want to expose to the player as they are exploring islands. And as you can see, density could still be a bit better. I have the density set low on my flora spawner to accommodate the trees, but that doesn't really work well with the grass, which could have a higher density. So maybe in the future, I'll create a whole spawner itself dedicated to spawning smaller bushes and grass like this. Regardless, I'm stoked with the progress I made this week, and it's only 3:15 here on Sunday afternoon, so I have more of the weekend to look forward to. As always, I want to give a huge shout out to the folks who support this channel and Dauphin's development on Patreon. Grammy supporters this month are Samuel SVD, Jess Sargo, Kyle Van Riper, James Cooper, and David L. I really hope you all enjoyed this episode. It was a really enjoyable week for me to finally work on something different than my tile map island generation. So I'm going to try to stay on the bandwagon, keep working on new stuff, and get another update out for y'all very soon. Until then.